is a theory of right what?
Ethics is the theory of right conduct. Logic is the theory of right reasoning.
Right reason. Thank you.
Yeah. And that little pitch I was giving for that epistemology apologetics class, right now we're talking about different ways of knowing. On Wednesday's class, when we come back from our long weekend, we're going to talk about logical fallacies. So that's certainly very interesting and very pertinent to society and what's going on right now. I have so many examples of logical fallacies in the news or my Facebook feed right now. It's just like a kid in a candy store. I'm trying to keep track so I can use them for examples in class. I may have to block out some names to protect the guilty, but logical fallacies. So anyways, ethics is the theory of right conduct. And then morality is the application of ethics. So that's the way I'm going to try to use those two words, even though ethics and morality often are used as synonyms. They're different words because they do have different meanings. So think of ethics more as theory and morality more as putting into practice what you claim to believe it is right or good or true. Any questions on that? It would be the difference between maybe like an architect or engineer who went and studied the theory behind weight loads and proportions and all those sorts of concepts. But morality would be like the carpenter or the construction worker actually putting those ideas into practice, building something up. And so that's how I look at the difference between ethics and morality. And so the first part of the book, I'm going to talk to you about presuppositions and the power they have in our lives. Can anyone tell me what a presupposition is?
Things you hold to be true without having to prove it.
Very good. It's just things you presuppose are true. And we normally get presuppositions by our culture. And there's a fancy word for it. It's called enculturation. And where our culture teaches us not only how to talk and what is dangerous, what is good, what is of value, but it also teaches us what is right and how we should behave. And there's three different aspects of enculturation. There's what we call norms, and norms are just like what they sound. It's what's normal. Your culture teaches you what's normal. And then we have ideals, things that we're striving for as a culture or society. And then we have laws, which give like a civic enforcement of certain values that we hold important. Now, not all norms have been made into laws, but they are seen as markers for our culture and our society. And so right out the get-go, you have to think about the incredible amount of influence your culture, your family, your education, your religion, your politics, your gender, all of these sorts of things are going to affect the way you perceive reality, the way you perceive truth, and ultimately, in this context, the way you perceive the right way to live. So part of being a critical thinker is you have to analyze your own biases and presuppositions first before you even come to the subject of which you want to explore, because you're going to have to hold those in check and say, oh, right, do I believe this because of how I was brought up, or because of what my mama said, or because of what my pastor said, or my professor said, or why am I holding this particular point of view as valid or true? So I'm really going to try to help. And that's part of what that first assignment I gave you is about. It's kind of helping you write out your presuppositions so you can kind of see your starting point and then compare it at the end of the class and see if any of those have changed. All right. Questions, comments on that? All right. The next thing we're going to move into is the power of worldviews. And so this is even bigger than your individual culture or subculture that you were brought up in. These affect, it's a real nice intellectual way to categorize and label people. Now, I'm normally not into categorizing and labeling people, especially not to judge them or condemn them, but it can be a helpful tool into at least in your mind. And once again, this is just an artificial construct that I made up. It doesn't necessarily make it true, but I'm a visual learner. And at least in the paperback version, it's on, my poor eyes are going, on page 6. And you'll probably get a mirror view there, but that's the little diagram I'm referring to. And I'll draw it with my hands in the air. So when we talk about worldview, I've kind of broken it down into 3 major worldviews. But I realized we have to take account into maybe pre-existing or sub-worldviews. And when we talk about worldviews, there's a fancy word for it called paradigms, but you could call them like goggles, because as you're enculturated or brought up, it's just like your society is putting a pair of glasses on you, and it creates filters through which you see the world. And most of us, unless we do some introspection and some critical thinking, just assume that the way we're perceiving the world is the way it actually is, or what we think is real is actually real. And this class is going to be like pulling back veil after veil after veil. I know as humans, we can never see clearly and completely through clear lenses, but I want to take away as many of those other filters as I can to try to help you get a clear vision as possible. But what's so interesting to me about paradigms or worldviews, it's literally like different pairs of goggles that different people in the world are wearing. And it colors all of their perceptions, and that in turn colors their judgments and their values. So I start with a circle. I love circles. And in the center of the circle, I start with the worldview of animism. Anyone want to tell me what animism is?
The view that everything is God, right? It's like everything is everything.
That's pantheism. That's coming up in a little bit.
So it's the belief that everything is living, or everything has a spirit.
Yes, very good, Dominique. So in animistic cultures, we mostly find them among indigenous or tribal groups. And I've talked to many missionaries who actually believe it is currently today the largest worldview. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but what they're saying is when you travel to different cultures around the world, there's like layers of other worldviews, almost like veneers put over the top of this core animistic belief. This belief, I'm going to qualify it just a little, Dominique, with virtually everything is alive or has a spirit, but some things are dead. And the reason they're dead is because the spirit has departed. Now, it's important here when we talk about death, especially in the context of this book and class, death does not mean annihilation or extinction. It means separation. So, and that's what we mean about death. I got a new coffee mug for Christmas. I'm very excited. It's very unusual. And this is definitely a living mug. This ain't no mass-produced store-bought mug. You know, it was hand-thrown with sacred clay baked in holy fire, and it has personality. It's unique. And every one of my favorite coffee mugs, here's this, at one point have died horrible, horrible deaths. And I'll never forget, I had this beautiful mug. I think it was from the 30s, and it had this monk on it eating oysters in a wine cellar. And I called it my decadent monk mug, and it was named Guido. And Guido went with me everywhere. And one day while I was teaching, it was actually during the final exam, I guess Guido couldn't take it anymore, and he leapt off my desk and broke into 100 pieces on the floor. I think the stain was in the old campus carpet until they bulldozed the building into oblivion. But the day later, I was doing another final, and one of my students came in. I was so distraught I had to leave class and just said to bring the finals by my office. But The next day, a student brought Guido back to me that he had glued together, and it was full of piping hot coffee. And I wanted to be gracious, but good Lord, it would be like if Fido got ran over in the road and someone sewed him back together and brought him back to you and said, "Here's your dog, Blackburn, it's okay." And it was really horrifying. And I still have the remains of Guido, but the spirit has departed. And so that is an animistic worldview. Now extrapolate that out to not just coffee mugs, but your vehicle, your utensils, your tools, your clothing, as well as all the things in the natural world, right? The plants and animals, but we'd also include things like rivers and clouds and mountains. These are all living beings with a soul and a spirit. All right, so that is the animistic worldview. Out of that, and I believe it is the most ancient of all the human worldviews. And even if you believe in like the Genesis creation account, something happened after the curse and they were thrown out of the garden and humans were scattered and they had all sorts of imaginations in their minds. But when we look at archaeology and anthropology, we tend to find things that point to this animistic idea, this idea of things being alive and have a spirit. For example, and then I'll move on. In the Southwest, for years, when they would find grave sites in the United States, they would find them also with broken pottery, broken cups, broken weapons, sometimes even animals and things put in there with them. And the idea was, the anthropologists thought, oh, it's a twofer. I mean, they had to bury this body and it was a great way to get rid of rubbish around the village or whatever at the same time. But as they began to understand more about an animistic worldview and cultures, they realized this wasn't just rubbish or trash being buried with the individual, but that these mugs and plates and weapons had been ceremoniously killed. And so you might find a mug like this in a gravesite, but there would be a hole punctured into the bottom, which meant it released the spirit from the physical object. So now that person that died would have the spirit of their coffee mug in the spirit realm. But as long as the spirit was still alive here, it couldn't be there for the person who had passed on. Fascinating. Very different from views of like the Egyptians and stuff who believed in this idea more of a resurrection, right? So you don't see broken stuff in the pyramids and Egyptian tombs because they believed that very person was going to reanimate that body, rise from the dead, and then use those items again. So really interesting what we've discovered from archaeology, whatnot. Now, as you can imagine, animism would be a very tedious way to live because you have to be aware of all these different spirits. Now, we too are all spirits, and my spirit is more powerful than the spirit that's in this coffee mug, but there's other spirits in this world that are much greater than mine, and I have to watch it. Like, what about the spirit of the forest? That's a much bigger spirit than me. I might have a bigger spirit than different bushes or animals, but not the collective spirit of the forest. And so if I'm going to go into a forest, I need to supplicate not just the spirit of the forest, but all the various individual spirits of the trees, of the bear, of the brook, of the thunderclouds. All those things I need to make sure I'm in right relationship with so harm does not come to me. It would even apply here, where first I would have had to talk to the spirit of my laptop, and then the spirit of the internet, and all these things, making sure I was in right relation so they wouldn't try to hinder or thwart this class I'm trying to give virtually. And over time, animism actually evolves or progresses into polytheism in many cultures. What is polytheism?
Many gods.
Many gods. Very good. And so, and it makes sense, right? So instead of me having to supplicate every bear and badger and tree and bush in a forest, if I can tap into the god of the forest, the lord of the forest, who among my people was called Cernunnos, the horned one. And he's depicted in Celtic arts and stuff as having either horns or antlers, and this was the lord of the forest. If I'm in right relationship with Cernunnos, then I don't have to worry about every tree and bush and badger. I can just be in right relationship with the overlord, who will then take care of all his minions. Same thing, if you're an ancient Greek or Roman and you're wanting to travel the Mediterranean, you don't want to have to spend time supplicating every squid, every shark, every manatee. Well, they don't have manatees in the Mediterranean, but you don't want to have to deal with all of that sort of thing, every storm, every wave. But if you're in right relationship with Poseidon or Neptune, he will take care of all the other little sub-minions. And so it makes a lot of sense. But even with this condensed, taking spirits and elevating some of them to the status of gods, little g gods, in first century Roman villages, it was not uncommon to have over 10,000 different deities in a village, if you can imagine. And in fact, we still speak the names of those gods and goddesses in our daily language, at least in English. Most of our days of the week are named after various Greco-Roman gods or Norse Celtic deities. The planets are named after gods. Even simple things like the god that lived at the edge of your property was called Terminus. The god that oversaw the orchards was called Pomona. And so we have, it's just amazing to me how different even our language shows our kind of pagan or polytheistic roots. Where if you think about like the Jewish days of the week or the Jewish holidays and what they're celebrating God's created order, and then their holidays are celebrating God's deliverance through history. I mean, how different than some of the things we celebrate, like Christmas, right? Christmas was kind of co-opted by Christians for the pagan Roman celebration of Saturnalia and the god Saturn, right? And we've kind of syncretized, and that's the veneer part we're talking about. There's not just a theistic or a pantheistic veneer over animism, but also over polytheism. Any questions about polytheism? So normally, go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment. I just think it's kind of interesting because, like Judaism has been around like so long comparatively to Christianity. They have all those individually completely unique holidays, but like Christianity didn't start until, a couple thousand years ago. And there's already just this wealth of holidays that are being celebrated around the world, and Christians being so spread out. I mean, it just makes so much sense of why, like, we're like, oh, we're not pagan anymore, but it's the holiday, I have work off, what am I going to do? Can't go celebrate Saturn, so okay, we'll just find a reason to celebrate God. They kind of, I don't understand.
Yeah, very good. And it was part of the church's missional policy. As long as you could incorporate the traditions of the people you were trying to reach without violating your Christian convictions, then by all means, incorporate them. But as you can imagine, it creates for some strange pairings at times, or trying to explain to children why we have Christmas trees and Yuletide logs and fairy lights in our trees, right? But if you understand the history of Celtic Nordic mythology, it all becomes perfectly clear. Anyways, and we could go on, right? I mean, that's just one holiday. We could talk about Samhain or All Hallows Eve, or what we call Halloween. That was the Celtic New Year, when the veil between this world and the spirit world was thinnest and spirits could cross back and forth. And so people in the old world, they didn't have pumpkins. That's a new world. Is that a fruit? And so they would use turnips, and they would carve turnips and put them in their windows and stuff to try to scare off dead relatives who may be coming to their house on Samhain. Or they would leave gifts or treats. This is where we get trick or treat. If you can't scare them off, maybe you can appease them off. But that's pure paganism. And the Catholic Church simply put a veneer over the top and then used it to talk about all those who had died in Christ, right? But they're still alive. And we see this throughout the world. We have the Obon Festival in Japan, where you go out and dance with your dead relatives. Fantastic. Or Dia de los Muertos in Mexican culture, Day of the Dead. And so we see this throughout the world. But I don't know a lot of polytheists today. There are a few revivalist movements. I know if you're familiar with Burning Man, it's kind of going back to that pagan roots, pre-Christian roots. Yeah. Even though it's not necessarily a religious festival, there's a lot of elements that go back to like even the Wicker Man, if you're familiar with that tradition. I just saw an article last year that there are certain people in Greece that are actually worshiping Zeus and Hera and all the ancient pantheons. If you can imagine, in the 21st century, people are actually worshiping. So same in Iceland, there's a revivalist movement of people worshiping Thor and Odin and Frida. And you're just like, wow, that's so amazing. They're done with Christianity. They want to go back to the old pre-Christian religions.
So when do they start sacrificing humans for blessing on their crops?
I'm hoping they'll be like neo or reformed druids or Odin worshipers. Let's hope, right? I could really do without the human sacrifice personally. Although Christianity is based on human sacrifice, if you can step back and look at it for a second, right? Anyways, out of polytheism, we get the three major worldviews that I think are most pertinent and relative today and affecting kind of our class. Even though I do agree that animism is around, unless you're traveling among more, unless you're traveling in more indigenous or native groups, you're probably not going to be seeing blatant animism, unless you're a fan of anime, right? And Japanese culture, very animistic culture. Miyazaki is one of my favorites, with like Spirited Away, which is like a bathhouse for the spirits, or Princess Mononoke, dealing with the spirit of the forest in Japanese culture. But I don't know how many people actually apply that to their daily lives, or if they're just seeing it as entertainment. Or I'm sure if you're from Japan, it may have some cultural significance for you as well. Anyways, from animism, we get polytheism. And then from polytheism, I'm going to talk about three major worldviews. The first one, the one you're probably most familiar with, is theism. And theism is the belief that there is a God, but this is not an abstract power or entity. This is a being with personhood or personality. So we're not talking about like in the Star Wars, the Force or something like this. This is a person, this being. And this being has created the world. He has all the omnis, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. God has all these different attributes or qualities. But God also wants to interact with his creation, with the world. And people that are theists believe God has done this through revelation, where God gave prophecies or insight or knowledge to the prophets of old, or maybe even in modern contemporary times, people believe the Holy Spirit still speaks to them, still impresses upon their minds, still prompts them, still directs them. And so The theism accounts for what we would call the Abrahamic faiths or Western religious traditions. So that would include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but it would also include more fringe groups like perhaps Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, would all kind of still come under that theistic worldview, although they might be kind of on the border there with some other worldview we're going to talk about. Okay, any questions about theism? Theism, all right. The next major, theism between those three world religions makes up over 60% of the world population. And the next worldview, pantheism, probably makes up another third or so. And pantheism comes from two Greek words, pan, which means all, or the cosmos, and theism, which means God. So literally pantheism is saying, like Elijah mentioned earlier, this idea of all is God, or God is all. So literally the cosmos or universe becomes synonymous with God. Now, depending on where you are in this pantheistic continuum, we would have Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, these different worldviews, kind of like the New Age movement out here in California. I don't even think they call it that anymore. I think they just call it Californiaism. But this idea of we are connected, everything is one, and that one reality is spirit. Okay. Any questions about pantheism? Already, I hope you're beginning to see, well, let me keep going and then we'll talk about the significance. The next worldview, which is by far the smallest, I'd say less than 10% of the world population, but it also carries a lot of weight, and that is naturalism, materialism. And I'm using this in a philosophical context. I don't mean like Mr. Natural, who's just running around naked with his big beard out in the woods. And by materialist, I don't mean like Cyndi Lauper, who's a material girl living in a material world. What I'm talking about is this worldview that believes only the physical material exist. There is no spirit. There is no soul. There's only physical material substance. That is what's real. And so both pantheism and materialism are what we would call monistic. Think of monocle or one. They are monistic worldviews in that they believe the underlying nature of reality is singular. For the pantheist, it's spiritual. For the materialist, it's physical. The theists are dualistic in their worldview in that they believe in both a spiritual part of reality and a material part of reality. It's almost like they're straddling these two worlds. Materialists only believe in the physical, and so we're going to find them in like the hard sciences. This is where you would find atheists, many agnostics, but they definitely control academia in the West, especially when you get into things like biology, geology, chemistry, anthropology, etc. We have a domination there, even though they make up a small percentage of the worldwide population. Okay, so in addition to those three major worldviews, which account for pretty much the world population, there's also like hybrid positions between each of them. So in between theism and pantheism, we would have panentheism, P-A-N, which means all, N-E-N, which means in, and theism, which means God. So panentheism means God is in all, or all is in God. Now, I know that sounds a lot like pantheism. All is God, God is all, but that little n makes a huge philosophic, theological difference. It's like in the New Testament when Paul talks about, for it is in him we live and move and have our being. Any questions, comments on panentheism?
Yeah, I had a question on that one. I've heard people make the argument that Christianity is panentheism. Panentheism. What are your thoughts on that? That verse is actually, I was going to quote that exact verse. Because most people think of it as theism, but because of verses like that, I kind of think maybe it is panentheism.
All right. Let me see if I can find an image real quick to share with you. I think it will help.
Well, wouldn't they extend that to inanimate objects where Christianity would not?
They, and the
Well-
part of them talking about it being panentheism, I think he's talking about more like the, I mean, generally people are referring to like, oh, God is omnipresent, so he is in all things and he's everywhere at the same time. So then they're like, well, it's really panentheism because they're trying to take away from the deity of Christ and the deity of God himself. And they're just like, oh, it's really just, you know, panentheism. It's not, you don't really believe in like, God, you just think he's everywhere. When no, it's God is unique and just, yeah. I think that's, if I'm just confused.
Let's see.
Personal messaging.
Can you see this image of theism and panentheism?
No.
We see your virtual meeting.
Okay, let me go back. I'm still learning. Thanks for being patient. Can you see that image?
Yep.
Okay, good. So in classic theism, we have God or the creator who is separate and distinct from his creation. So really clear-cut differences. In fact, when I was a little kid growing up, fundamentalist Baptist, we used to sing this song called Somewhere in Outer Space, God Has Prepared a Place. And I had this image as a little kid that we had the universe and there's like this brick wall at the end of the universe and then God lives somewhere beyond that somewhere. Or we were some little crystal ball or fish bowl and that God kept in his water closet or something. I just had such weird imagery, but I had such a sense of the otherworldliness or detachment of God from the world. The problem is, if you're not careful, this way of thinking will lead you to deism, which is the hybrid in-between position between theism and naturalism, materialism. Because deism believes in a God, but it's kind of like the blind watchmaker or something. He put in the laws of nature, wound it up, put the world and cosmos into motion, and then he took off and he's doing something else. And he may or may not come back. So for a deist, and that was what many of our founding fathers were, they did believe in God or providence and that he had made the world with a certain rules and order. And so if we could understand the rules and order of the world, we could figure out the right way to live. I mean, very different from a theist, right, who believes God has actually revealed his truth to us, that he has given us his own Holy Spirit or some way to communicate his will to us. And we find that in all traditions of the Abrahamic faiths. Panentheism is that in-between position because, man, I wish I had my own drawings up, but I'm not sure where I put them at the moment. If I was drawing pantheism, I would simply put one circle or one oval and I would have God / nature because they're synonyms. If you pulled the leaves off a tree or picked the flower off of a plant, it would be like picking something off of God's head. And so this idea that the universe is God and there is no distinction. But panentheism is showing there is a difference between God and the natural physical material world. But the natural physical material world isn't separate or outside of God, but it's actually nestled inside of God. And Caleb, I actually personally believe this is a much more biblically correct position.
Okay, yeah, I was kind of leaning
Talking
that way
about
myself.
panentheism. I rarely call myself a panentheist though, because people get confused and they think I'm saying pantheist. And I already got enough stuff to deal with, people thinking about me without actually, someone tried to get me fired once for being a panentheist at the school. I couldn't believe it. They went on my Facebook page, took a bunch of screenshots of me hugging trees or letting critters go out of my house without squishing them or kissing rocks. And they were just like, you have a very dangerous professor at your school, which I agree with that. But what they didn't understand was that I had a much more orthodox position than they did. They had a much more detached God view of the world. Like God's out there somewhere and we're down here. And it's like, oh no, honey. We right now, sitting here looking at our computer screens, all of this is happening within God. I made my own drawings of these sorts of things, and I'll try to find them later, but I put hatches through them. Like I put lines showing that God permeates the universe. That's his omnipresence, right? There's no place where God is not. See the problem here? You've got a whole universe that God is not permeating. Here, if you show that God permeates the universe, but the universe does not permeate God. The universe.
So what's the difference? What's the difference between like a Christian panentheist and like a non-Christian panentheist?
Well, you could have a Hindu or a Buddhist panentheist or things like that. The difference, of course, in the Christian part would be God incarnate coming into that physical material world within himself.
So I have two questions.
Okay.
Does this require eternal generation of creation? Because how do we distinguish the Orthodox view that God freely chose to create, but he is other than his creation? My second response would be, in 1 Corinthians 15, it says, Jesus will reign, then hand the kingdom to God, so that God will be all in all. So God permeating creation in the panentheism sense seems to be eschatological, not necessarily right now. But I do agree that God is omnipresent in some very real sense, that he does permeate all of creation in some sense now, but not in the unique sense that he will in the eschaton, if that makes sense.
Yes. I went a little too fast, so let me back up to theism, that worldview piece of theism, the belief that there is a God that is a person. In addition to that, this God is both immanent and transcendent.
Okay, yeah, that's how I would put it. Okay.
So, and those are two fancy words for, it means God transcends or is outside or beyond creation, but his immanence puts him in and permeating creation. So
Okay.
What a paradox, right? Right off the get-go of trying to define this theistic God, we have a God who is inside and outside simultaneously.
Okay. Yeah, I can, that makes better sense.
Okay. Good. Well, we got time. One of my favorite creation accounts comes from Jewish mysticism in the Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about the first act of creation was God had to separate the light from the darkness. And so this idea is, if the totality of reality is God,
Mm-hmm.
that in order for God to create something, there's no out there for God. It's one of my favorite things I like to tell my students is we can do one thing that God can't, and that is we can go outside.
Right. So it brings up the question that God's relationship to time, because does God have a succession of events by which he created? Or was there some sense before creation that he existed that creation did not? And then what do you do about God's immutability and his changefulness?
Wow, you are on fire, Dominique.
Dominique, these are some good questions.
Okay, so I'm sure I got my mirror image going, but if this circle represents eternity, time, man, I wish I had my whiteboard. Time becomes like a bracket inside of eternity. But if
theory or B theory of time?
yeah, if God dwells in eternity, it means he is before time, in time, and after time, simultaneously.
Okay, so on that account, eternity is not ongoing time. It's outside of time?
Yes.
Okay.
Time is a measurement.
Okay. Is it a
Yeah,
succession?
and so think about it. If you're living in eternity, who cares if it takes you 10 minutes to walk down to the mailbox or 10,000 years?
Right.
You're in eternity. It really doesn't matter.
So is God eternity, or is eternity inside of God?
God is eternal.
But which is inside which? In your fancy diagram. I'm just asking.
You could make God the outer edge of that circle, but remember, it's just a symbol. There is no outer edge to God. There is no reality outside of God in a theistic worldview, or a pantheistic worldview for that matter. It's just they mean very different things about God than I do. What was your other question, Dominic? You had some great ones in there.
No, yeah, I'm just trying to think through. So
Okay, keep thinking. I'm going to go back to the Kabbalah while you're.
Okay, so classical theism holds that God is immutable, so he doesn't have a succession of events.
Correct.
I'm kind of on the edge with that, because I think if God could freely choose to create, then we would have to assume that he could not have created, which means there seems to be a time when God wasn't creator, but he is creator, which seems to imply a change. And
let me ask you this, Dominic.
Yeah.
Can God have any new thoughts?
It depends on his relationship to time. So is time a succession of events, or does God see time all at once?
Yes.
What if our time is different than God's time? Like maybe God does have a timeline, but it's overarching and above our timeline.
But
Our
what if
timeline was
God
created.
isn't confined to a timeline at all?
Right.
Like,
In
why are we
eternity,
saying
there
he
is
has
no
to be
time.
confined to a timeline?
Right.
Say that again?
If
In eternity, go ahead.
well, I was saying, why are we saying that God has to be confined to a timeline? Because that would technically negate everything else if he's not. Like, if time is our perception, our creation,
What time is God's creation?
No time around God. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. It just depends on how we define time. So if we define time as a succession of events, which not everyone does, then
how do you define time?
I would say time is a succession of events. So I'm in the present, the past is gone, the future is unfolding.
Yeah,
now,
but
what if our
God,
time
he can see all of it. Like for us, we don't know the events. So I feel like
I
remember that. See, so God is before, after, but also he can incarnate into time all simultaneously. Remember the scripture that says the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world? What the heck is that supposed to mean?
So here's what I'm trying to avoid. Is Jesus still on the cross in the past, or is he no longer there?
There is a sense in which the present is eternal.
Okay.
Like right now, this class, this conversation has an eternal element to it. Even though we're seeing it in a linear fashion, there is another sense in which this has always been. And then it gets freaky if you want to get into like the law of eternal recurrence and all that, but let's not for right now. I want to go back to the Kabbalah real quick. So in this Jewish mystical account of creation, God is the totality of reality. But in order for God to create something, he has to make a space within himself. But because of his glory, anything he created inside of himself would just be obliterated or blinded by his glory. So God had to create like a cosmic womb within himself, which he shrouded in darkness. And it was in that place of darkness that God created space and time and the world we know today. When I first heard that account, I was like, wow, that makes so much more sense to me. This idea of that I am actually in God. God isn't out there somewhere. Well, he is, but he's equally in here.
That makes more sense of God's interactions with the world.
Yes. Now, Aristotle, the pagan Greek philosopher, believed that matter was eternal. He also believed in a God, not just like the Greek gods, but I think he believed in a higher God beyond the Greek anthropomorphisms and all of that. But this became a big problem in the 12th century when Thomas Aquinas tried to incorporate Aristotle's philosophy into Christian theology, because this pagan Greek believed that the world always existed, or matter in the universe always existed. So how would you reconcile that with God creating the world? And you kind of touched on that earlier, Dominique, of this idea of the world has eternally been created. Or if you're an idealist like Plato, you understand that concepts and ideas are more real than physical material things, because physical material things come and go, they transform, but the concept or ideal of a thing is eternal. It can't be created or destroyed. I'll never forget, I raised a lot of children in my life, and one of my nephews was being a little snippy with me one day. I mean, you, E-man. Okay.
That wasn't me. I was about to ask a question when you said something. I was going to let you talk. My bad.
Okay, I'm just getting a lot of background noise from somebody. It was Elijah. Go ahead, E-man.
You said you were speaking about the mind, and you said how the mind doesn't. Repeat that again. I got sidetracked because everything was going on. But you said something in the mind that doesn't go away, like it's eternal. Repeat that again. You said the mind doesn't die, or something like that.
No, I was talking about the eternality of God, and I was talking about in Platonic idealism, this idea that ideas or concepts is what's most real.
Yeah,
they are eternal. They cannot be created or destroyed. They have always existed. But the physical material manifestation of those ideas, they come and go.
Okay, and then you said the mind, and you said that's when you said the mind can't be destroyed. You don't think at some point, like, if somebody couldn't withstand what was going on, regardless of like that, the mind can no longer take it anymore?
Well, if I said the mind couldn't be destroyed, I misspoke, which I do a lot. So if you hear me misspeak, say, did you really mean that, Blackburn? Although I actually do believe the mind is eternal. Anyways, back to my story about my nephew. One of my nephews was being snippy with me. And he said, "Come on, Uncle. It's not like you've been around forever or anything." And I said, "Well, actually." And that's when I asked the question, can God think any new thoughts? He's obviously not omniscient if there's knowledge that he doesn't already know, which means God has always known me. And because I'm an idealist, I believe God's idea or concept of me is much more real than this physical manifestation of me you're seeing before you. And we have the Psalms that tell us, right, that before any of our inward parts were formed, God knew us. God has eternally known me, which in my opinion means I have always existed in the mind of God. And this was exactly how Thomas Aquinas reconciled matter being eternal with God being creator, because he said the creation has eternally been in the mind of God. Fantastic.
So I had a question when you kind of back into the what the Jewish mystical view of the creation account. One, they mentioned that they created a space within God as if of a womb, so everything that happens is happening inside of God, which this is where I can see why you're a panentheist, a biblical panentheist, and the people that are hardline theist, everything is separate. But I think it's somewhere in the middle, because like if we're just a part within God himself, sin can't exist within God. Like God can't exist where sin, he can exist where sin is, but it can't dwell in him. And I think Scripture teaches that. That's why sin can't dwell in heaven and all that, because it can't stand the glory. And so that makes me think it's like, okay, so in that view, all the sin is happening within God himself, not him being present in the area of it happening, but within God himself, which means that God, in essence, is allowing sin to reign in his person, which I don't think is biblical, or maybe I'm just misunderstanding.
All right. That's a lot there. So let's unpack it little by little. First, I'd like for you to define for me what sin is.
Sin is a deviation from God's will or desire or...
Perfect. Classic divine command theorist answer. All right. Which means sin is not a thing. It's an adjective or an adverb. It's describing behaviors or actions, but it's not a thing in and of itself. It's not like, ooh, don't touch that, it's evil. God, when he created the world from a theistic perspective, made everything good. Okay, because everything was in accordance with how he made it. Coming up soon, we're going to have the classic problem of evil dilemma, the Euthyphro dilemma that I believe Plato came up with that one. And the idea there is, I'll jump ahead a little, is this idea that if you take the presupposition that God exists, and if you take the presupposition that evil exists, your logical conclusions are both really bad, because the first logical conclusion you could come to is God is all powerful, but not all good. In other words, he doesn't have the power to stop evil, otherwise he would have done it. Or God is all good, but not all powerful. And neither of those are very satisfactory theistic solutions to the problem of evil in the world. But if you take evil, and Augustine's solution to this was to deny that evil was a thing. Now, he wasn't saying evil wasn't happening in the world, but it's not a physical material thing. Evil has to do with our relationship with how God has created us to be, or how he has commanded us to behave. So it's almost like evil becomes like a hole or a shadow rather than a physical material thing in and of itself.
But what about death then? Because death is not a good thing, and I think Scripture says, sin and death entered into the world, so sin is in essence a bad thing.
Yes, it separates us from God.
Yeah, so how do you separate
Why would
something
death be
that's
bad,
within
though?
God from God?
Why do you say death is bad, though?
Well, I mean, it's never denoted in any good term. Everything, death is always associated with evil in the Bible that I can think of. It's always a punishment. It's always a result of the thing. Death itself is going to be defeated, and death and hell are going to be cast into the lake of fire at the end. I mean, the only things going to the lake of fire are the bad, the
Right.
bad,
But guess where hell and the lake of fire have to be?
Okay, so
question,
so
right?
that's what.
In your view,
So I have a
it's
question.
within God.
It has to be within God. Otherwise, if you have God and you start adding anything to him, like God plus hell, God now diminishes in reality to the degree that you give hell reality. And now God is not everything. God begins to shrink. And this is a problem.
But God can create, just as God is. I was going to break my brain.
If God is the totality of reality, where is he going to put stuff?
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about if everything's created inside of God, then when he creates things, they're still like within him, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so the annihilationist view, This is the argument they have, because if hell is required that it's in God, then evil is not necessarily banished from the universe because it's still in his presence. So how is that a victory? And that's what they would argue. That's why annihilation needs to be true.
But God's also in hell right now because, you know, he, like a psalmist says, you know, he goes down the depths of hell and you can't escape from God there.
Well, Sheol is not hell, it's really the grave, but in
Sure,
time,
but if you take the omnipresence of God, you can't cut out little exceptions of where he's not.
right. But if we want to think of a theodicy of a victory, the ultimate hope would seem to be evil is completely banished, not in God isolated in some context. We would kind of want it
Well,
gone.
since we're doing heretical views, let me throw in Origins. Origins didn't believe, he was a, I think, 3rd century church father. And he believed that those who were sent to hell, including Satan himself, would not be annihilated, but one day even Satan would be reconciled to God. I mean, I love that view emotionally, but I don't think that's a scriptural view.
Yeah, I mean,
Along with annihilationism, I don't think that's a scriptural view.
me either. That's their argument, and it seems to be a good argument.
It's a very logical argument. I'll give them that. And it's even compassionate in the sense that I would rather someone just be put out of their misery than to suffer forever. Mm-hmm. But I think it has to do with that counter movement of heaven and hell. They come as like a match set.
They have to, because like he said, like the annihilation of evil. I think that's too easy. There's too much conflict. It's too much power involved, like that's going on in order for, you know what I'm saying? Like in order for somebody to truly embrace, like that we speaking of, like all what God has created, you got to embrace the good and the bad, and you have to understand, like you said, like when you go to a jungle, you have to like embrace it. And like you spoke about a creature with the horns, I gotta look him up, but it's
Ernunos with the C.
So like Elijah said, my brain is on a whole different level right now. I'm just over here thinking. So yeah.
Wonderful. That makes me so happy. All right, I have one last hybrid to do for you, and we got 4 minutes, I think, and that is in between pantheism and naturalism, materialism. And where those two come together, for sake of a better word, I'm going to call it scientific pantheism. And this is where you have people that believe everything is spirit. Thank you, Elijah. People that believe everything is spirit, and those who believe everything is matter. They simply let energy and spirit become synonyms. And so it's really interesting. And you see this if you ever watch the movie, What the Bleep Do You Know? Or The Secret. It's dealing with that sort of scientific pantheism. And basically this idea that God is the energy permeating the universe. Fascinating. But between theism, pantheism, and materialism, it kind of rounds out most of the people in the world, although there are those like hybrid in between positions. And I just find it as a helpful visual chart as I try to talk about these different worldviews. And the point of all this, back to ethics, I know we kind of went out to the far reaches of the universe there for a moment, or into the mind of God, but how this relates back to ethics, think how profoundly differently you are going to live in the world based on which of those goggles you're wearing. If you're an animist, think how differently you're going to treat plants and animals and even what in the West we would consider inanimate objects. Remember, for the animist, the only inanimate objects are dead things. Everything else is animated by a spirit, even things like rocks. Think how differently you might start treating a rock if you actually believed it was alive. Polytheists, you're kind of beholden to whatever that particular deity is. But even in the scriptures, we have God kind of rolled out in almost a progressive manner. When God is first introduced, he's introduced as like this primal spirit, right? The spirit of God brooding over the face of the waters. But then through scriptures, it begins to progress into this God that's a creator. He's a person. He cares about his creation. And so we get God manifesting in terms of of him saying, I am the greatest of all the gods. We didn't even have the concept of monotheism until later on in the Genesis account, because in the beginning, it's like God pitting himself against the gods of the Egyptians, against the gods of the Philistines, against the gods of the Canaanites. But by the time we get to the major prophets, it's like, by the way, I'm the only real God. All those other things you were worshiping were false gods. And so we have even this progression given to us in scripture about the character and nature of God.
So I mean that's great. I had one more question kind of on the scientific pantheism, not to delay this last if you need to get it.
Go for it.
You said they think God is basically the energy between the spiritual and the matter. Do they
They're
believe
just
that
turning those two words into synonyms, spirit and energy.
do they believe that energy has a conscience, or do they believe it's just kind of a?
Yeah, but it would be more like the force kind of.
Okay. Have you seen his Dark Materials from the BBC?
Mm-mm.
So that's because I had started to watch the show, and it's really interesting, by the way. But I clicked because that's kind of exactly what they present. They present it as like dark matter is what in this alternate universe is called dust, and it's basically they think it's the bad, evil Nazi Catholic Church bad guys are like, oh, it's original sin, and but it's alive and it's trying to get adults, and once you hit puberty, it hits you and you turn evil, and that's when your sin.
Send me a link. I'd love to check it out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But at halfway through, I don't want to spoil it, but it's like it can talk to you. It's an energy, but it talks to you and it's alive. And I was like, oh, that sounds really kind of wonky.
Yeah, I'd like to check it out. All right, we're out of time, but let me just close this off by saying, depending on your worldview or those goggles you're wearing, it's really going to profoundly affect what you think ethics are and how you should live morally. So if you're a theist, and I don't care if you're a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, and you believe someone created you and you're going to have to give an account to that being someday, that is going to radically change the way you live your life. If you're a pantheist and you believe you actually are God or a part of God, well, imagine how you would live if you truly had realized God consciousness, because that means whatever you will is good. And if you're a naturalist materialist and you believe you're just a physical material being that was organized out of the physical world, and when you die, your body will just go back into the world, you're probably going to live very differently than someone who believes you have an immortal soul, or someone that believes that they actually are God. All right, I hope that was helpful and not just mind disturbing. And Lord willing, I will see you guys on Tuesday, the 19th. We didn't get very far, but that's okay. Do that discussion board so I can take roll.
Do we need to do the quiz?
If it's listed in week 1, I don't remember if I had you do a quiz the first week or not.
Yeah, there is a quiz, but by what day? Like today, Friday, Sunday?
Let me look. Usually everything is due Sunday by 11:59 p.m.
I think it shows the 17th on there is the due date.
Okay, thank you. You got there quicker than me. Okay. Any other questions?
You said it was due the 17th?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different from the syllabus. I don't know if anybody else noticed that.
Look in week 1.
Okay, yeah, I was just looking through the syllabus at all the due dates, and then I was looking at the due dates there listed on Populi.
Yeah.
They're all a little bit different.
Go by Populi.
Okay.
Is there one for week 1 in Populi?
Yeah, it's the one due on the 17th.
Okay, that's correct. Sorry, I realized I didn't have a syllabus, and I just tried to use the one before my book was done, and so there's a little bit of wonkiness in there still. And sorry about that, but go by the weekly lessons in Populi. That will give you the accurate time. All righty. You're free. I'll linger a bit if anyone wants to chat, but you do not have to stay.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Take care, Bryce. You done, Elijah, or you got more on your mind?
Actually, I forgot to back out. I was just sending you that email of the show with the I'm sending you an email right now with it, because it's literally like, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, the energy has a conscience. I was like, it's just a show. This is like